At 10:37 a.m. on December 7, 1944, Staff Sergeant Frank "Dusty" Rhodes twisted his cheek against the plexiglass of his P-47D Thunderbolt canopy, staring down at the Philippine jungle canopy. The air was thick with the metallic smell of exhaust and the heavy tropical humidity that seeped into everything. He was flying a one-man reconnaissance attack mission far deeper into Leyte than doctrine allowed, searching for a ghost, a concealed Japanese tank column rumored to be staging for a counterattack. The odds were impossible. His Thunderbolt, designed as a high-altitude interceptor, was now scraping the jungle floor at 250 feet, the slowest, fattest target in the sky. Waiting on the ground were an estimated 35 Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks, supported by at least 7 anti-aircraft positions, likely 20 mm cannons, all concealed beneath the dense foliage. Standard U.S. Army Air Force procedure for attacking a fortified tank column was a coordinated strike by at least 6 P-47s, utilizing high-speed dive bombing. Rhodes was one plane. He was alone. The problem was not the tanks. It was the element of surprise. The Japanese had developed a deadly, almost invisible, early warning system using ground spotters and radio triangulation, allowing their anti-aircraft guns to be sighted and ready 10 seconds before the U.S. fighters could even acquire the target visually. In the last 3 weeks, this system had cost the 5th Air Force dearly. In the next 40 minutes, Rhodes would either be reduced to a smoking hole in the mud, or he would prove that a subtle, forbidden change to his machine could nullify the enemy's greatest tactical advantage, clearing the way for an Allied ground assault and changing the course of the Pacific War's fiercest island battles. His hands were steady on the yoke. He knew the risk. He knew the consequences. He also knew he couldn't afford to fail. He dove into the green. The engine howled, pulling him toward the impossible, toward the concealed guns, toward the tanks that didn't know they were already in his crosshairs. It was a race for life, a race against an enemy he shouldn't have been able to surprise. The ground grew closer, blurring into a sea of dangerous greens and browns. Rhodes pulled the trigger. Frank "Dusty" Rhodes hailed from the gritty, industrious heart of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His family home was a triple-decker apartment near the Monongahela River, the air always smelling faintly of coal dust and molten steel. Dusty's father worked the afternoon shift at the Jones and Laughlin Steel Mill, a back-breaking 7-day-a-week job that forged the planes and tanks the war demanded. This environment defined Dusty's early life. He was not a natural scholar. He was a natural mechanic. After dropping out of high school at 16, he took a job at a dilapidated garage on the edge of town, specializing in the maintenance, and more importantly, the modification of aging Ford Model A's and Chevys. His blue-collar expertise was in getting the most out of machinery that was already past its prime. He could hear a cylinder misfire at 40 yards and knew how to coax an extra 5 horsepower from a rusted engine block, using nothing more than a new spark gap and a meticulously sanded manifold. Dusty developed an almost obsessive focus on minute details and a stubborn unwillingness to accept official specifications as the limit of a machine's potential. He was a rule breaker, not for malice, but out of necessity. A car owner didn't care about the official spec. They cared about getting to work tomorrow. This aggressive focus on practical performance over bureaucratic paperwork was a personality trait that would later put him on a collision course with the officialdom of the U.S. Army Air Force. He joined the service as a staff sergeant, not a pilot, but a crew chief for the powerful P-47 Thunderbolt, and he brought his steel mill discipline and garage mechanic ingenuity with him. The P-47 Thunderbolt was nicknamed the Juggernaut for its sheer size and 8 massive 50 caliber machine guns. It was a brute, designed for speed and altitude. But in the close, jungle-shrouded skies over the Philippines, it was failing. The official doctrine for ground support, medium-altitude patrol followed by a high-speed steep dive to deliver ordnance, was proving a death sentence. The enemy's system was simple and deadly effective. Japanese forward spotters, hidden in the dense jungle, carried shortwave radios. When a U.S. fighter formation was heard approaching, they would transmit a brief, coded signal. A central command post would triangulate the position and immediately radio-specific anti-aircraft positions, mostly the accurate Type 98 20mm cannons and Type 96 25mm machine cannons. The key to the enemy's success was the speed of detection. By the time the P-47s began their dive, the Japanese crews were already sighting their guns, adjusted for the incoming trajectory. The U.S. pilots were caught in a trap. Too slow for high-altitude cover, too fast for low-altitude evasion. The toll was staggering. The official statistics were grim. The 5th Air Force was suffering a 38% casualty rate on all dedicated ground attack missions against fortified positions. 37 P-47s had been lost in just 9 weeks during the Leyte campaign, the vast majority to ground fire, not aerial combat. The human cost weighed heavy on Dusty. He knew the men, whose names were now just lines in a casualty report. Sergeant Tom Mac McMillan, a cheerful radio man from Galveston, was shot down on October 28th near Tacloban. Dusty had helped McMillan tune his radio to pick up baseball scores. Then there was Captain Samuel Albright, a hotshot pilot who had survived the Guadalcanal. Albright's P-47, the Philly Flyer, took a direct hit from a 20mm shell while pulling out of a 6,000-foot dive on November 15th. Dusty watched the smoke column from the edge of the strip. The worst was Lieutenant James Jimmer Calhoun, a gentle farm boy from Iowa who flew Patches, a plane Dusty personally maintained. Jimmer was killed on November 30th when a ground fire volley ripped through his fuel line and the engine caught fire almost instantly. Dusty had checked the fuel lines himself just hours before, meticulously following the official service manual. The failure, he knew, wasn't in the maintenance. It was in the fundamental vulnerability of the aircraft's approach. Dusty's frustration grew into a cold, hard resolve. Every time he signed off on a pre-flight checklist, he felt complicit in the pilot's potential death. The mechanics and crew chiefs whispered in the hangars, swapping stories of pilots describing how the tracer fire seemed to be waiting for them, how the ground guns felt sighted before the attack even began. They called it the Leyte curtain. Dusty felt a crushing helplessness. The men were dying because the official system was broken. The equipment was designed to be fast, but the enemy's detection was faster. One cold, grease-stained night in the workshop, as the tropical rain hammered the corrugated iron roof, Dusty sat staring at a schematic of the P-47's systems. His focus was not the engine, but the radio. The root cause, he realized, was noise. When a P-47 approached its target in a standard attack, the pilot would maintain a high-speed approach to conserve energy for the climb-out. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a roaring 2,000 horsepower radial, generated a colossal acoustic signature. This engine noise, coupled with the speed, provided the enemy spotters with ample time, up to 45 seconds, to hear the plane, calculate its vector, and call in the coordinates. The engine itself was the biggest, loudest early warning system the Japanese could ask for. Dusty's technical explanation was simple. The P-47's engine was running too rich at standard attack throttle settings necessary for the high-altitude performance it was designed for. This translated into a disproportionately loud, throbbing low-end acoustic signature at low altitude. The official procedure required a sustained, high RPM dive and pull-out, maximizing the time the aircraft was a screaming, audible target. Dusty dared to voice his concern to Lieutenant Commander Wallace, the engineering officer, a man who spent more time with specifications than wrenches. "Sir, the low-level acoustic signature is too high. The Japs are hearing us 5 miles out," Dusty said, wiping oil from his cheek. Wallace, stiff and impatient, dismissed the idea instantly. "Staff Sergeant, the R2800 is operating within spec across all phases of flight. The casualties are attributed to insufficient pilot evasion or pilot error, as the preliminary reports suggest. We will not be deviating from the official engine settings, which have been approved by the Air Technical Service Command. It's a waste of man-hours. Just maintains the aircraft as directed." Dusty bit back a sharper reply. The official answer was a lie, a cover for a flawed doctrine. The men were not failing. The system was. He was faced with a stark moral dilemma. Follow the regulations, sign the daily inspection sheet, and watch more men like Jimmer Calhoun die in explosions of fire and smoke. Or break the regulations, modify a critical piece of the aircraft's machinery without official authorization, and risk a court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, or even prison time for tampering with government property in a combat zone. The official regulations were a death warrant. Dusty knew he had to break the rules to save lives. He chose the risk. The trigger moment was not a grand event, but a small, heartbreaking one. It happened just after 11:12 p.m. on the 2nd of December. Dusty was walking back from the mess hall, the tropical night air heavy with the scent of damp earth and stale coffee. He passed the line of P-47s. Their metal skins cooled to the touch. He saw Captain Albright's friend, a young pilot named Lieutenant Miller, standing alone beside the empty revetment where the Philly Flyer used to sit. Miller wasn't crying. He was just staring at the muddy ground. "You going up tomorrow, Miller?" Dusty asked quietly. Miller didn't turn around. His voice was raw. "Yeah, I am. And I know what's coming, Sergeant. They'll hear us coming. They always do. It's like flying into a goddamn drum kit." He paused, shoulders slumped. "Dusty, if you can change anything at all, just to give us a second more, just a half second of surprise." The pilot didn't ask for a miracle. He asked for a half second. That half second was the difference between a successful gun run and a smoking wreck. That was all Dusty needed to hear. He watched Miller walk away, the sound of his boots echoing softly in the darkness. Dusty walked straight to the small unlit mechanic's shed. He pulled a wrench from his toolbox, the cold steel familiar and reassuring in his palm. He decided to act. He would do it alone, outside the official logbooks. He would start with Old Man, the P-47 assigned to him for deep maintenance. The plane he knew inside and out. The one nobody would miss for a few hours. The night was quiet, save for the incessant chorus of jungle insects and the low, distant rumble of artillery. Dusty pulled his work lamp close, its weak yellow light struggling to penetrate the gloom of the hangar. He worked on the engine's complicated fuel injection system, a labyrinth of metal tubing and precision machined parts. His hands, already grease-covered from a day of routine maintenance, dove into the tight space near the supercharger. He had to reach an almost inaccessible component: the automatic mixture control unit. The official setting calibrated the fuel flow for a high-altitude combat mixture, which was the source of the low-level acoustic problem. Too much fuel was leading to a rich, loud combustion signature. The smell of oil and high-octane aviation fuel was overpowering. Dusty worked meticulously, using a specially filed down wrench to access the two locking bolts. The space was so tight he scraped his knuckle badly, a warm, slick rush of blood mingling instantly with the cold grease. He barely noticed the sting. He focused on a tiny internal adjustment screw on the AMC unit. He calculated that a slight manual leaning of the mixture, only a few thousandths of an inch, would slightly reduce the overall power output at full throttle, but, crucially, would drastically decrease the audible acoustic output at low RPM, low altitude attack settings, shifting the engine noise frequency into a range less detectable by the human ear at distance. It was a compromise, a trade of 5 horsepower for a moment of invisibility. His fingers, thick from years of heavy work, fumbled once, dropping a small brass retaining clip into the cowling. He cursed under his breath, sweating heavily in the tropical humidity. He worked on his back, the cold metal of the fuselage pressed against his shoulder blades. He worked until 01:15 a.m., using a feeler gauge to confirm his adjustment, a 0.03-inch turn of the screw, essentially creating a new, unauthorized lean attack setting. He replaced the cover plate, secured the locking bolts, and wiped away any trace of the operation, ensuring the exterior of the AMC unit looked untouched. The whole process took 2 hours and 45 minutes of intense focus. The risk was immense and clearly acknowledged. If the engine failed due to an unauthorized setting, it would be attributed to his tampering. A crash would mean the pilot's death and Dusty's probable court-martial for willful negligence, possibly treason, in a time of war. The paperwork was clean. His modification was buried deep inside the workings of a complex machine, a secret kept by grease, cold metal, and a 0.03-inch turn of a screw. He looked at the massive P-47, now silent in the darkness. He felt a moment of intense doubt, then a complete, unyielding commitment. He was ready to face the consequences. The sun rose on December 7th, hot and blinding. Dusty stood at the edge of the strip, the powerful Pratt & Whitney engines of the 5th Air Force coming to life around him in a cacophony of engine rumble and propeller wash. His plane, Old Man, was scheduled for a solo reconnaissance attack run. Lieutenant Commander Wallace had assigned the mission, unaware of the subtle alteration beneath the cowl. Rhodes watched the pilot, a quiet 23-year-old named Lieutenant Pete Hammer Hampton, walk the perimeter of the Old Man. Hampton looked tired, his eyes heavy with the accumulated fatigue of 3 weeks of relentless, dangerous missions. Hampton climbed the ladder, settled into the cockpit, and strapped in. He said nothing to Dusty about the plane, and Dusty said nothing about the modification. There was no communication about the subtle, potentially fatal change. The pilot taxied out. Dusty stood rigidly, his arms crossed, feeling the vibration of the engine through the soles of his boots. He watched the massive P-47 turn onto the runway, pause, and then blast forward, its twin-row radial roaring. The roar, however, was different, slightly higher in pitch, less of the deep, chest-vibrating throb that characterized the standard P-47 takeoff. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. All he could do was wait. The mission was a standard interdiction run along a suspected supply route near the Palais San Vicente area. Hampton flew the P-47 low, maintaining a steady 300 knots at an altitude of 3,000 feet, standard pre-attack procedure. The jungle below looked like an unbroken, treacherous green carpet. 10:32 a.m. Then the radio crackled. "Hammer, this is Control. We're picking up scattered ground chatter. High-frequency spikes in your sector. Possible staging area ahead. Be advised." Hampton's voice was calm, almost bored. "Roger. Control. Scanning." He dropped the nose, descending sharply toward the jungle floor. His altimeter plummeted toward 500 feet, his speed climbing to 400 knots. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. By official doctrine, the Japanese spotters would have heard the approaching aircraft approximately 3 miles out, giving them nearly a minute to call in coordinates. 10:35 a.m. Hampton saw it first. A telltale shimmer in the canopy, a break in the uniform foliage that suggested heavy vehicles. It was the tank column, perfectly concealed. The standard doctrine was to climb sharply, deliver the wing-mounted bombs, and pull out. Hampton ignored the doctrine. He knew if he climbed, he was dead. He kept the modified P-47 low, hugging the tree line, relying on the plane's reduced acoustic signature to delay detection. He flew over a small riverbed, the propeller tips spitting water. Suddenly, McKenna's voice crackled over the radio from a P-38 monitoring station. "Hammer, enemy ground fire. I'm reading AA tracers in your 5 o'clock low." Hampton's response was short. "Negative, McKenna. I see the tanks. No tracers." The radio chatter was confusing. The Japanese spotters, relying on their hearing, had been delayed. The spotters were just now reporting the sound of the approaching fighter, only 1 mile out, giving the gunners less than 15 seconds to acquire the target. The system had failed. The invisible plane was visible only to its pilot. 10:37 your stern. a.m. Hampton was directly over the column. He opened up the throttle, the engine responding with a high-pitched, smooth roar. He pushed the nose down, sighting a Type 97 Chai-Ha medium tank, sitting perfectly aligned in the clearing. 10:37:03 a.m. He fired. The 8 twin .50 caliber machine guns hammered, shaking the airframe with the violence of the discharge. The tracers arced, a brilliant orange line straight onto the target. Impact. The heavy machine gun fire shredded the lighter armor of the Japanese tank's engine deck. A small dark puff of smoke appeared, followed by a louder, catastrophic eruption. The tank exploded. The sound of the explosion was the enemy's first clear indication of the attack. Now, the ground guns opened up. The air suddenly filled with the red and white arcs of 20 mm and 25 mm tracer fire, streams of light reaching for the P-47. 10:37:08 a.m. Hampton didn't pull up. He didn't climb. He plunged the plane into a low-level, high-speed run, flying through the column. He banked hard right, the wingtip clearing the top of a coconut palm by mere feet. The vibration was bone-jarring. Another Chai-Ha tank was in his sight. He had used up his surprise. Now he was fighting for his life, trading speed for maneuverability. 10:37:12 a.m. He fired a short, 5-second burst. The impact was immediately visible. The machine gun rounds stitched a line along the turret, jamming the main gun. The fighter streaked past. 10:37:20 a.m. The enemy's fire was ferocious, yet still disorganized. They were firing at where they thought the plane should be, not where it was. Hampton pulled a sharp left, defying the P-47's reputation as an unforgiving, heavy fighter. The 0.03-inch adjustment had allowed him to close the distance without detection, giving him the advantage of a zero-range attack. Now he used his own momentum. 10:37:35 a.m. A 20-millimeter shell hit the tail boom. The sound of the bullet impact was a terrifying, loud clang of metal on metal. The P-47 bucked violently, but the heavy frame held. The plane needed to survive only long enough to destroy the column. He circled back in a tight, dizzying loop. He could see the gunners now, frantically reloading, their faces visible in the canopies of the gun positions. 10:38:05 a.m. He found the anti-aircraft positions, which were now more dangerous than the tanks. He strafed the first one, emptying half a belt of his remaining ammunition. The gun crew scattered. The Type 98 silenced in a cloud of dust and debris. 10:38:15 a.m. A third tank exploded, hit by a stream of fire that targeted the exposed driver's vision port. The attack continued for a terrifying total of 4 minutes and 43 seconds. Hampton made 8 separate passes over the column, each one a dance with death at treetop height. He was not only attacking the tanks, he was systematically suppressing the anti-aircraft. The Japanese defenders never regained their coordination. They were always 7 seconds behind the P-47's maneuvering. 10:41:43 a.m. Hampton's guns went silent, guns dry. He had fired every one of his 4,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, plus dropped his 2 500 lb bombs on the center of the staging area during his 5th pass. Below him, the scene was chaos. 5 tanks were burning furiously, 3 anti-aircraft positions were wrecked, and the column was scattered and disorganized. He pulled the heavily damaged, oil-streaked P-47 into a steep climb, escaping the inferno he had created. He called control. Hammer airborne. Supply column destroyed. Confirmed 5 tanks, 3 AA guns. Returning to base. He had destroyed 5 tanks and 3 anti-aircraft positions in 4 minutes and 43 seconds. The impossible run was over. Dusty was waiting on the tarmac when Old Man sputtered to a landing. The aircraft was a mess. There were holes punched through the wings. The rudder was ragged from the 20 multi-caliber hit, and the fuselage was streaked with hydraulic fluid and oil. Hampton climbed out, his flight suit soaked in sweat, his face smeared with soot. He was calm, almost unnervingly matter-of-fact. Dusty immediately began his inspection. The crew chief, Sergeant Harris, a burly man who rarely showed emotion, whistled low when he saw the combat damage. "They threw everything but the kitchen sink at him," Harris muttered, counting the shrapnel tears. Dusty went straight to the gun bays. The confirmation was there. 800 rounds remaining, the gunner reported. "No, wait. 0. He fired everything. Dusty. The guns are dry." Then they checked the results. The official debrief confirmed 5 destroyed tanks and 3 anti-aircraft guns silenced. The results were astounding. Hampton's attack run was the most effective solo anti-armor mission of the campaign to date. The crew members clustered around the pilot. "How did you do that, Hammer?" a stunned ground crewman asked. "They always see us coming. The tracers were always waiting." Hampton just shrugged, looking over at Dusty. "I don't know," he said simply. Maybe they didn't hear me until I was already on top of them. The old girl flew nice and low, though. Real quiet. The astonishing success of the old man's mission immediately became the central topic of conversation in the officers' mess and the mechanics' hangars. Later that afternoon, a lieutenant named Rodriguez, who had suffered multiple close calls from ground fire, approached Dusty in the engine shed. He was looking at the old man, a perplexed look on his face. "Dusty," Rodriguez started, his voice barely a whisper against the distant idling engines. Hampton said his plane felt different, quieter at the bottom of the dive. The Japs were totally surprised. "What did you do?" Dusty hesitated for a long, uncomfortable moment. He was risking his entire career. "I leaned the mixture, Lieutenant," he finally admitted, his voice low. "Just a few thousandths of an inch on the AMC screw. Takes the scream out of the engine at low RPM settings. Doesn't affect max power, but it takes the low-end acoustic signature down just enough. Gives you a 5-second delay on their spotters." Rodriguez stared, his eyes wide with understanding. 5 seconds of warning was the difference between life and death. No official documentation, no engineering approval, just whispered conversations. Word spread like a jungle fire. By morning, 2 other crew chiefs were asking Dusty for instructions on the 5-second fix. By afternoon, a handful of trusted pilots were specifically requesting their maintenance crew check the AMC unit without mentioning the modification. By evening, crew chiefs for a full squadron of P-47s were discreetly making the tiny, illegal adjustment under the cover of routine service. The officers, including Lieutenant Commander Wallace, noticed the change in mission results almost immediately. Missions that had once returned with shattered airframes and dead pilots were now coming back with fewer holes and more mission success reports. They attributed the change to improved pilot tactics or greater enemy confusion. They couldn't notice the change because the engines still ran within spec. The modification only changed the power curve at low throttle, not the maximum output. The forbidden solution was now an underground doctrine, a secret shared by men who trusted wrenches more than regulations. The change was not lost on the enemy. Over the next week, the Japanese air units and ground forces on Leyte began to report a series of highly successful, devastating American ground attacks. The pilots of the Toko-Dai Air Group, who had been enjoying a relatively easy time with the predictable P-47 runs, were now confused and cautious. One report, filtered through the complex intelligence channels, came from the famous Rikugun Shosa Army Major Minoru Okamura, a decorated veteran of the China campaign who specialized in close air defense coordination. Okamura's report, dated December 10th, noted a fundamental tactical shift. The American P-47 aircraft are appearing with an uncanny suddenness. We are unable to acquire their approach vector with sufficient time to sight the Taha anti-aircraft units. It is as if the engine sound is severely muffled until the aircraft is almost directly overhead. This is allowing the Thunderbolt to conduct zero-range attacks before we can coordinate fire. He wrote, "This juggernaut is rolling and vectoring faster than it should. We believe the Americans have introduced a new short-range warning nullifier or a silent propeller design." Intelligence officers on Leyte ordered the examination of every piece of American wreckage. They found nothing. The aircraft were P-47Ds, the same model they had been fighting for months. They focused on new radio components, new radar systems, and new wing designs. They did not focus on the fuel-air mixture ratio. The psychological impact was significant. Caution replaced aggression. Japanese radio intercepts, often garbled but sometimes clear, began to include phrases like, "Avoid that formation, they are too quick to acquire," and "We were unprepared for the approach speed." The enemy doctrine began to adjust, calling for wider, less concentrated deployments, a defensive tactical shift caused entirely by a 0.003-inch adjustment made by a staff sergeant in a damp hangar. The raw data was undeniable, a cold, hard validation of Dusty Rhodes's dangerous gamble. In the 9 weeks leading up to the modifications, unofficial adoption, September 25th to December 6th, 1944, the 5th Air Force recorded a 38% casualty rate on ground attack missions against fortified positions, resulting in 37 aircraft lost. In the 4 weeks immediately following the underground spread of the 5-second fix, December 7, 1944 to January 4, 1945, the casualty rate dropped to an unprecedented 23%, with only 11 aircraft lost in the same type of mission. This represented a staggering 39.5% reduction in aircraft losses. Furthermore, the number of confirmed armor kills skyrocketed. In the week following the modification, the now invisible P-47s destroyed 47 confirmed Japanese tanks and anti-aircraft artillery pieces, securing key sectors for the advancing U.S. ground forces on Leyte. Conservative estimates credit the undocumented acoustic signature reduction mod with saving at least 26 aircraft and 26 aircrew in the first month alone, not including the countless ground troops whose lives were saved by the swift elimination of armored threats. The sharp, unexplained drop in losses and the increase in mission effectiveness could not be ignored indefinitely. An investigation was launched by the Air Technical Service Command on January 15, 1945. An inspection team arrived, led by Lieutenant Commander Wallace, the officer who had previously dismissed Dusty's concern. The engineers went through the P-47s, searching for a pattern. They were baffled. Everything was within spec. It took 2 weeks of meticulous teardowns before an unusually persistent warrant officer noticed the telltale scratch marks around the automatic mixture control unit on the aircraft of the most successful pilots. He discovered the unauthorized 0.003-inch adjustment. The report sat on the desks of 3 different captains and a colonel for weeks, a moral hot potato. The debate was fierce. Should they punish the non-commissioned officers who had broken regulation and saved dozens of lives, or should they approve the modification? Pragmatism eventually won. The modification was too effective to ignore. Rather than acknowledging the field modification, the ATSC issued a revised engine service bulletin. The bulletin mandated a recalibration of the AMC unit on all P-47Ds operating in the Pacific. The adjustment was integrated into the official service doctrine for the P-47D-28RE model in February 1945. Staff Sergeant Frank Dusty Rhodes received no official recognition. He was never court-martialed. He was never promoted. He was transferred to a training assignment in the Hawaiian Islands to teach advanced field engine maintenance, a move that kept his innovation quiet and his presence distant. Official documentation attributed the improvement to engineering analysis of high-stress combat conditions and routine factory improvements. Dusty Rhodes' name was never mentioned in any official report regarding the change. The lives saved were their own reward. Frank Dusty Rhodes survived the war. He left the service in late 1945, refusing a full-time training officer position, stating, "I'm a mechanic. not a general. He returned immediately to Pittsburgh, to the soot-stained familiarity of the Monongahela Valley. He didn't seek out a high-paying defense contract job. He bought the small, dilapidated garage where he had first learned his trade, renaming it simply Rhodes Auto and Machine. He spent the rest of his life fixing broken-down civilian cars, his hands always smelling of oil and steel, the scent of his working-class roots. He never talked much about the war. When he was asked about his time in the Philippines, he would only mention the heat and the mosquitoes. He never spoke of the invisible P-47, the Forbidden Adjustment, or the lives he saved. The only ritual he maintained was an annual brief phone call with Pete Hammer Hampton every December 7th, a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of the day the system was beaten. Dusty Rhodes died in his sleep in 1988, at the age of 68, in Pittsburgh. His obituary, a single paragraph in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, mentioned his service as a staff sergeant in the Army Air Force during the Pacific Campaign. It made no mention of an engineering modification, an unauthorized adjustment, or the near-silent approach of the Thunderbolt. It merely stated he served honorably before opening his own garage. The doctrine of leaning the mixture for low-level attack spread rapidly. It was adopted not just for the P-47, but unofficially for several other radial engine ground attack aircraft. It became an unwritten rule in post-war training for low-altitude close air support, often taught by former crew chiefs and pilots who had used the secret fix. Decades later, a military historian, Dr. Elena Petrova, piecing together the unusual statistical anomalies of the Leyte campaign, discovered the truth in a discarded warrant officer's field note mentioning the AMC screw alteration. Her subsequent research revealed the extent of the underground adoption. Her calculation, based on the sharp decline in losses, confirmed that the small, unauthorized innovation was responsible for saving hundreds of Allied aircraft and air crew throughout the latter stages of the Pacific War. The life of every man was a direct consequence of a moment of rule-breaking. This is how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official committees debating specifications in an air-conditioned room, not through generals drawing lines on a map, but through enlisted men who understand the deep, mechanical truth of their equipment. Dusty Rhodes didn't seek glory. He sought efficiency and survival. He risked court-martial and prison because the choice was stark. Follow regulations and watch men die, or break the rules and save them. He didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He acted. The ultimate contrast is between the individual sacrifice of reputation and the collective, invisible impact of a single act of courage on the fate of hundreds. If you found this compelling story of wartime ingenuity and bravery meaningful, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories that official reports often overlook. Leave a comment telling us what piece of wartime equipment you want us to examine next. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.